Chapter 19. Elizabeth. Elizabeth's ire softened somewhat by morning. Carl's words had played over and over in her head as she'd tossed and turned late into the night. Finally, she'd been forced to admit that she hadn't acted in the best way either. Yes, Carl should have told her, but she couldn't expect the man to have had no past before her. And now that she was married, she did need to work on being a partner instead of only thinking about herself. So she'd prayed for God's help in that area and finally drifted off to sleep. Though she did still worry that Carl's feelings for Emma weren't entirely gone, she had exchanged vows, and that meant something to her. It seemed to mean something to him as well. So as she dressed for the day, she decided to make an effort to forgive him. "Good morning," he said as she opened the bedroom door. She noticed he made no move to kiss her this morning like he had yesterday, and she wasn't sure if she was relieved or hurt. "Good morning." "Will you be going into town again today?" "If that's agreeable with you. I'd like to continue working on the dress I started and also see if there's a way to advertise my services to the women." He issued a single nod. "I was simply asking to see if you needed the horse saddled again today." "Oh yes, thank you." He looked at her a moment longer before dropping his gaze back to his Bible and continuing his reading. Elizabeth hesitated only a moment before preparing breakfast. She didn't like the uncomfortable tension that filled the room, but she knew a lot of it was her fault. If she told him she forgave him and understood, she had no doubt that the mood would lighten. But she wasn't sure she was ready to do that yet. So instead, she tried to ignore the tension as she prepared breakfast. After the meal, she cleaned the dishes and then headed out to the barn. As promised, Carl had Brownie saddled and ready for her, and her hurt dissipated a tiny bit more. He didn't have to do this for her. He could have told her she was being unreasonable and to just do it herself, but he hadn't. Perhaps he had been telling the truth, that he no longer had feelings for Emma. At the very least, it seemed that he was telling the truth that he wanted to make this marriage work. "Thank you," she said as she took the reins and swung up on the horse. She opened her mouth to say more, but decided against it. She still needed more time. They could talk then. Elizabeth enjoyed the quiet ride into town until she felt it again. The hairs on her arms stood on end and her senses prickled. She glanced around, trying to appear unconcerned, but the feeling of being watched unnerved her. If someone was watching her, though, they were doing a good job of hiding and waiting because she heard nothing out of the ordinary. No breathing, no movement of leaves, no snapping of twigs. She was glad the town was visible, but the eerie feeling didn't leave her when she reached the general store. A large man with a deputy star upon his chest leaned against the post, staring at her. She'd never seen him before, but he looked at her as if he knew her, and his gaze was cold and hard. She dismounted and approached the post warily. "Is there an issue at the store, deputy?" "Not at the store, no, but there is an issue at the clinic." Elizabeth's eyes widened and she glanced back toward the clinic. "The clinic? Is Emma all right?" He folded his arms across his chest and narrowed his eyes at her. "Mrs. Cook and her father are both fine, physically, but it appears that someone broke into the clinic last night." Elizabeth gasped. Why would anyone do such a thing? Then her eyes widened as she realized this deputy, a man she'd never met, must be questioning her because he thought she was to blame. "You don't think I had anything to do with it, do you?" He studied her for a minute before standing to his full height. "Well, I don't know. It has been brought to my attention that you and Mrs. Cook had a disagreement yesterday." "A disagreement, yes, but I have no reason to break into her father's clinic or steal from her. Plus, I went home to my husband, Carl Baxter, afterwards and was there all night. You can ask him." The deputy nodded and fixed her with a pointed stare. "Oh, I will. Don't you worry. I know you're new here, but we don't take kindly to people stealing from our own." The door to the general store opened then, and Mr. Brown stepped out.
"That's enough, Deputy Masterson. You are keeping this woman from getting to work."
Deputy Masterson rubbed his chin for a moment before agreeing.
"Very well, but I'll be keeping an eye on you, Mrs. Baxter."
Elizabeth waited until the deputy had sauntered away before turning to Mr. Brown. "Thank you. I don't know why he would think I had anything to do with a robbery."
"I do. This is a small town and word spreads quickly. I heard Christian telling everyone in the saloon about your disagreement with Mrs. Cook last night. Now, it's none of my business, but I can tell you that I have known both Carl and Mrs. Cook for years. While it is true that he was sweet on her at one time, I have always found him to be a man of his word, so if he tells you that there's nothing there anymore, I'd believe him."
Elizabeth nodded. "I'm trying to, but I was a little caught off guard when Rebecca told me yesterday. Neither Carl nor Emma had said anything about their history." Mr. Brown stepped into the store, holding the door open for her.
"I believe it's because it was just that, history. When Mrs. Cook remarried again, Carl accepted that, and that's when he placed the ad. Now, I know he knew love wouldn't happen right out of the gate, but he also had hope that it would grow with whatever woman God sent his way."
Elizabeth sighed. "He is being very kind about all of this." Mr. Brown stopped and looked her in the eye, his gaze steady as if he was trying to convey his words through it.
"That should tell you everything, then."
Yes, it probably should. She'd thought that this morning, but hadn't said anything, and now she felt guilty. She would tell Carl she was sorry as soon as she returned home. But before then, there was someone else she needed to speak to. "I'll talk to him today, but I should probably go check on Emma, let her know that I had nothing to do with this." Mr. Brown nodded and smiled as if his work was finished.
"I'm sure she knows, but a kind word never hurts. Just be careful. Word spreads quickly in this small town, and I'm sure others will have heard the same information that Deputy Masterson did."
"Thank you, Mr. Brown. I will." Elizabeth set down her things upstairs and then hurried over to the clinic. She waved at Emma through the window before opening the front door. "I'm so sorry, Emma. I heard from the deputy this morning that someone broke in. He seemed to think it was me, but I wanted to assure you that I had nothing to do with it. You believe me, don't you?" Emma's mouth formed a tight smile. "I do find it hard to believe you would be capable of such a thing, but you are the only new person in town, which I assume is part of why the deputy suspects you, and some might say you would have a reason to hurt me. Because of Carl's feelings for you?" Even though Carl had stated he no longer cared for Emma, Elizabeth still wasn't convinced that was the case. But she would never take that out on the other woman. She could not believe this was happening. Never in her life had she been so unfairly judged. "But you were right. I spoke with him and he said he no longer has the feelings he once did. It's given us a setback, but we're both committed to making this marriage work." "I'm glad to hear that, and it does seem a silly reason to steal from someone, but it is understandable for the deputy to have a hard time seeing who else it might be." "Could it have been a random robber? Didn't Sarah say that's how that woman was killed?" Elizabeth tried to remember the woman's name. "The one who Mr. Jennings was supposed to marry?" "Pauline?" Emma nodded. "It is possible, though in that case the robbers were after the money in the bank, and they did it openly. This break-in happened at night when no one would be likely to see anything." Elizabeth pursed her lips as she thought. "Well, you certainly know the people in this town better than I do, and since I know it wasn't me, it was either a random act or someone trying to blame me." She paused and looked at Emma. "Do you think it could have been Rebecca?" Emma's brow lifted again. "Do you really want to cast aspersions on her without proof, knowing how it feels?" Elizabeth shook her head. Emma was right. She didn't know Rebecca, and therefore had no idea if the woman had told her the information out of malice, or simply because she'd thought Elizabeth should know, and she certainly had no proof the woman was behind it. No, but I do wonder why she told me about you and Carl. You said she had an issue with Kate, but does she have one with you or Carl as well? Not that I'm aware of. Perhaps she really thought she was doing the right thing. Elizabeth had her doubts about that. Rebecca had been smug about it, like she'd enjoyed telling Elizabeth. I just wish the deputy had a better option than me. Emma stepped forward and placed her hand on Elizabeth's arm. I understand, and I am sure the deputy and the sheriff are looking into it. Whoever is behind the break-in will be brought to justice. Elizabeth could feel the promise in those words. Emma might be saying she didn't blame her, but it seemed she had her doubts. And why wouldn't she? Elizabeth was new to town, and no one had a vested interest in her innocence besides Carl. If even Emma didn't believe her completely, why would the sheriff or the deputy look any further than herself? I hope so. Thank you for at least listening to me. Of course, I wasn't lying when I said that I hope we can become friends. Elizabeth smiled softly. It seems I could definitely use friends. Is there anything I can do to help here? Elizabeth looked around, but the clinic appeared orderly and tidy. Perhaps the break-in had happened at the back? Emma shook her head. No, what you can do is create a beautiful poster that I can hang in here, letting everyone know about your business. Emma might have her doubts, but Elizabeth appreciated that she was willing to still help and give Elizabeth the benefit of the doubt. That was on my list of things to do today. Good, so get it done, and when you have a few done, swing back by and we'll hang them together. That should quiet the town gossip as well. Though it was not usually her nature, Elizabeth reached forward and hugged Emma. Thank you. Then she hurried back to the general store. She had a lot to do today if she was going to finish a dress and make posters and hang them.